Well, here we are again. I've got some stories to tell you, some instructional mechanic stuff, and some funny stuff, and just stuff, another day at the shop. And part of me misses going to, putting on a uniform and going to work every day. You didn't even have to think about what you were going to wear. You just put on the uniform and went to work, wore the uniform all day, and then you gathered them up at the end of the week, and the uniform man would clean them up and all. Incidentally, I had this American flag patch that I put on my shoulder. And I was at a school, Craig Van Battenberg's Up Your Voltage 18. That's how long ago that was. That was in 2010. And this Egyptian guy asked me if this flag meant anything to me, and I said, I paid to have this flag put on my shirt. This is the flag of my country, and I love the flag and I love the country. And he didn't understand that. Now, he was from Egypt, but he was a friendly guy, and I got along with him okay. But I thought of that when I saw that flag on there. But anyway, shop foreman and me were good buddies. Sometimes I'd get a little aggravated with him. Sometimes he'd get aggravated with me. And there was this 7.3 diesel situation that we ran into, where this guy was 18 years old when I was born, and he had been shop foreman for 14 years when I went to work at the Ford place in January of 1985. And so, or let's see, I think it was June or something. I can't remember. It was the middle of 1985 when I went to work there. And so he'd been in the field a long time. The problem with him was he was confused into thinking that, when he came up, everything was either turn signals or, maybe some misfires, and that was about as hard as it got. But, he had aged his way into a situation where things were a lot harder to figure out. Well, this particular electronic diesel supposed to have, 55 to 80 psi. Most of the time they were bouncing right along where you see that gauge is. That's not really fuel pressure that's a problem. But the one that came in that we were working on had a tendency to start hard. It would start, but it started hard, and it had only 26 pounds of fuel pressure. And the ones of you that are familiar with these will know that underneath this Y, down in the middle of the valley, there's a fuel pump that rides on top of the camshaft. It's got a plunger in it. And that fuel pump supplies the pressure goes through this filter housing to the injectors, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that works in a minute. We were all wrapped up with drivability problems. This was a rack they had, or one like this. It had drivability problems written on it in pink whiteout, and this whole rack was nothing but drivability problems. And so a lot of what I did was troubleshooting, and I'd get paid to do the troubleshooting. I was kind of a diagnostician on a lot of jobs. If it was going to take a long time to do it, he would say, well, we're not going to tie you up on that job. But now, after Eddie put the fuel pump on there, because they took over, he needs to put a fuel pump on. That job pays about 6 hours, and you can do it in about an hour and 45 minutes. It's a good job. But anyway, Eddie popped the fuel pump on it. Wouldn't start. Blew a lot of white smoke. I've talked about this a time or two before. You might remember. All right. And so this is how those injectors work. Now, this is all being fed in from the head. And when that solenoid's got about 2 ohms, so it'll operate really fast, 115 volts going in here, and it jerks this up and lets all go in here on top of this piston. You might notice this piston is 7 times the size, as large on top as it is on the bottom. And so the fuel is fed in through the head, the passages in the head here, there's no rings on here and all that. All you're really seeing when you pull the valve cover off, is the top of the injector and all. But what it does is, that pressure that's created, this pressure is multiplied. Whatever the pressure is, if you got 500 pounds of oil pressure that's going in here, it's basically going to drive that piston down with 500 pounds of pressure. Pascal's law multiplies that times 7, and so you got 3,500 pounds of pressure, and that causes the injector to pop. You know how diesel injectors pop it'll pop that pintle open so that it can spray the fuel out there, and that mists the fuel out real fine and all that. Well, this lets the oil pressure enter and all that. So the fuel pressure in this area on this particular vehicle was low. All right, so that was, and after we put a fuel pump there, the fuel pressure was back up to where it was supposed to be. It was, back up around 50 some odd pounds. All right, so now whenever I went over there to look at it after they almost burned the starter up, and they begged me to come over and ask them why it wouldn't start, because it was starting before it wouldn't start now, I went and looked at these readings on the scan tool. This is the new generation star tester. I saw that the IPR was maxed out. The ICP, injector control pressure, that's the oil pressure, was at 3,364 psi. Multiply that times 7, and that's how much fuel, the pressure we were spraying in there. Fuel pulse width was only 0.60. All of these look good. This was maxed out, and this was way too high. Whenever you're starting it, it ought to be about 1,000 to 1,500 pounds when you're spinning it over. This one here was way under more than that. And you might notice this doesn't go to 100%. It only goes to 65%. And that's the injector control. That is the that control solenoid down there that's for the oil pump. So basically, this is oil pressure, and fuel pressure was back where it ought to be. But we couldn't read fuel pressure with the scan tool because there was no sensor for that. So anyway, I basically told Philip, I said to unplug the take both the batteries off, and he couldn't understand. He said, well, I want it started. I said, you're flooding it. You can't flood a diesel. He said, yeah, you can. You put too much fuel in there, it's flooded. That's where all the white smoke's coming from. We took all the battery cables off, put them back on, and fired right up. So anyway, he learned something from that. Well, most all of these 2150 motorcraft carburetors, you were supposed to set the float level at 3/4 of an inch. That was a rule of thumb, right? But if you looked up the specs on a particular calibration and carburetor, the one I was working on was supposed to be set with this reading at 810 thousandths, which is a lower fuel level in that bowl than 3/4 of an inch. If you put it too high, then it's going to start, when you shut it off, it would start siphoning, and you'd see it dripping in here, and it would basically flood the engine. So if you didn't set it at 810, that doesn't seem like a significant thing, but anybody that's done a lot of work on carburetors understands that. And so basically I was setting the float level. He comes walking up and he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm setting the float level. He goes, set it on 3/4 of an inch. And I said, no, you don't do that on this one. 810 thousandths is what it's supposed to be set on. And he was wanting to argue about that. He liked to argue anyway. He'd come over and just start an argument just so he could be, he was bored. If I ever saw him standing out in the middle of the shop looking around with nothing to do, I tried to hide so he wouldn't look over where I was at and come walking over there. And so I decided I would baffle him a little bit. This was the kind of vehicle it was. And I said, that doesn't apply to this one because it's got an exhaust heat control valve and a heat riser on it. And he shook his head and said, what? And I said, yeah, see that exhaust heat control valve right there? And it's also got a heat riser down there. Well, he didn't have any idea what this thing was there for because they just were only there, put on there for 2 or 3 years. And this would enable the early fuel evaporation system that, feeds exhaust across here to, keep the fuel from vaporizing, from condense. And it helps the fuel vaporize when there's cold weather. They didn't want fuel that going across there all the time. And so to prevent the heat riser from sending hot air across there when it wasn't supposed to underneath the carburetor, they had this little valve to close that off, and it was controlled by the engine controller or something. I never really dug into that, but anyway, I noticed that some of them had that on there. A little closer look at it here. This is what it looked like. This thing here, that's an exhaust heat control valve is what it is. And you notice the diaphragm, it defaults to the closed position, as I remember, and then whenever vacuum is applied, it opens up and it lets exhaust heat go through there if the heat riser is in a position. Of course, some of the heat risers had a bimetal spring, some of them had a diaphragm with a vacuum line and all that, and this one here may have been teed in there so that it opened the exhaust, that heat riser, and this at the same time. I don't know. You might or might not be interested in that if you don't work on older cars. You might think, who cares? This was another deal on these K-cars that ran bad, and they were General Telephone, that we had a contract with those people, and they were really hard to please. And when those cars got some miles on them, every one of them came into us for work. We didn't have any books on these things. They just had this funky little carburetor you see there. And what these things would do was whenever the air conditioner kicked on, they would almost die. Now, it was a feedback carburetor. And we worried with that. You really couldn't pull any codes on the thing. And I was at Chrysler school one time, and I said, why is all these doggone K-cars idle so rough when the AC kicks on? They almost stalled, and we were fighting with these things all the time. And the instructor didn't have any idea what to tell me, but this other mechanic, he says, if you'll flat file the bottom of that carburetor, you'll find out that it's got a little warpage to it, and it's pulling just a little bit of air in there. And I said, well, that's an interesting thought. I had never even considered that. So the next time I got one in, I hooked up my meter to the oxygen sensor, just a one-wire oxygen sensor, and I was watching that oxygen sensor switching. When the air conditioner kicked on, that oxygen sensor would go lean. All right, so when it went lean, the engine would almost stall. Well, I could take just a little bit of carburetor spray with a little tube on it, and right at the carburetor gasket, whenever that air conditioner kicked on, I could just spray just a little bit of carburetor spray at the base of that gasket, and that oxygen sensor would maintain its voltage, and the engine wouldn't do that. And I said, well, that's what he was talking about. Because the thing was so long and skinny, you can see how it would warp. So I took it and I blew all the gasoline out of it, because you don't want to turn a carburetor upside down with gasoline in it, because it gets trash all up and everything. Then you got to rebuild it. Holding it right side up, I very gently blew and dried everything out of it. Blew it out really good so it was completely dry on the inside. Turned it over, and I flat filed it. You know, stuffed some paper down in here so I wouldn't get anything in those. Flat filed that son of a gun, and it started getting shiny out here and working its way toward the middle. And when I got it where it was perfectly flat and shiny all across here, just with a big old file that I was using, real careful. You got to have some skill there. After that car ran so good, I couldn't believe it. Totally astonishing to me. One time I ran into an issue with Philip, though, where I had one that whenever you would crank it cold, the choke would close, and whenever you fire it up, the choke is supposed to open about 1/8 of an inch, and then within a minute it ought to be fully open. Of course, you got that fast idle cam. Well, the thing closed the choke. This one did. It would stall when it was cold, but it didn't have that other problem because we had already fixed that. And so he walks over there and he says, "What are you doing?" I says, I had to drill these rivets out, and I turned that spring a little bit and put a little more tension on there, because what would happen was the air coming in would pull the choke plates open farther than they needed to be. The fast idle cam would catch it, and then it would have, wouldn't have enough choke for that early cold start, and then it would stall. And so I said, I'm going to put a little more tension on this spring so that it won't do that. He goes, "Oh, you're not going to fix anything that way. That's ridiculous." And I said, well, that's the way it works. I said, I'll tell you what. I didn't want to fight with him. I said, I've got to put it back together anyway. So I tell you what we can do. You let it get cold a few times and go test drive it. And if you want me to work on it some more, I will. But this is what I'm doing to address this concern. And he test drove that car and let it get cold about 4 or 5 times. And finally, I happened to be over there where I could hear him, and he didn't see me. And he was handing the ticket back to the dispatcher for the last time. And he says, "Well, I can't really see anything wrong with it, but I'm still not happy with it." But he was trying to convince me that there was only 2 problems this vehicle could give. One of them was timing belt issues, and the other one was carbon in the cylinder head. And I don't know why. He had the thought that once you find the 2 problems an engine or a car can give, that's all you need to look for. I mean, and that came out of the 1950s and 60s, which is where he came from, This was him. He was spooked by an RS laptop. He's a real conservative guy, which I am too. And he didn't trust anybody. He's real paranoid. So Gary Butler found some of these laptops, just like you see here in the dumpster, that were in the back of the IRS building. They threw away a bunch of old junky laptops. They didn't wipe them or nothing. They just threw them away. So Gary got one, plugged power cord into it, and set it on top of his toolbox. And I said, well, that's interesting. And it would pop up and say Internal Revenue Service, and then if you let it sit there a while, it would go into this monochrome green screen fish screensaver. No telling how much the IRS paid for that back those days, because those were old laptops. And so he comes walking up, and he said, "What are y'all doing?" I said, "Well, we're fooling with this IRS laptop." And he saw where it said IRS on the screen. It had a search query bar, and I typed his name into it, Philip Johnson. Oh, man, he just really got loud and angry and ugly and said, "You get my name out of there, you sucker. You get my name out of there. I mean it right now." He thought I was going to trigger a tax audit or something. It's funny as all get out. But anyway, that's how paranoid he was. This is the parts room. That's Mark Whitehead. And there was a lot of standing around in the parts room talking while we were waiting for parts. There was bull sessions went on in there. Usually when I went in there, I knew if at all possible, I'd walk in there with a part number. And I'd give them the part number, and I'd say, "This is what I need." They'd put it on the counter, and I'd be out of there while these other guys still shooting the bull. Now, sometimes I wouldn't have the part number. I'd have to have the calibration code, or I'd have to have other stuff. Sometimes they'd ask me questions like, is it a 16 or an 18-gallon tank? And I said, how am I supposed to know that? Like on then I finally figured out that on a Taurus sedan, it had a 16-gallon tank, but a station wagon had an 18-gallon tank. But the parts book didn't say that. See? And furthermore, the parts book sometimes would call something a different name than the shop manual called it. Like if it was an engine mount, they called it a transmission mount, and that caused confusion. And so one time I was standing over here, and I had this rubber O-ring for a Taurus fuel pump, sending unit, and I was playing around with it like a rubber band. I just had it was left over from a job I did, and I just pulled it like a rubber band, and I shot it through that door, and it went up into here, and it went up into a bin, and I could see it up in there. It was in an empty bin where it went. I didn't do that on purpose, and I just left it there. And about 2 weeks later, and every time I went in there, I could see that in there. I told it wasn't Mark, it was another guy. And I said, I need the fuel O-ring for this. I actually needed one for this Taurus fuel pump. He said, we don't have those in stock. I said, yeah, you do. I know where it is right now. I can tell you what bin it's in. He goes, what? And I pointed to that bin up there where I had shot it in there, and he was totally flabbergasted that that thing was in there. Well, the shop foreman that I just showed you in the previous slide, he was telling a story about how he was terrified of snakes, just scared to death of them. And his hunting dogs managed to get into a bunch of water moccasins down there in the creek, and, you know, was splashing around. He was talking, waving his hands around. You know, he told a lot of funny stories. And while he was talking about those, and he was reliving all that stuff, I went and got a piece of black hose and slid it over his shoulder, and I thought he was going to do a backflip right there. Well, there was a heavy truck guy that was from up north one time, and that knothead was, he always thought that everybody was smart. He used to tell people from up north were smarter than people from down south. I said, well, wait a minute, why did you come down south? He goes, because I like the weather. And I said, well, that makes you smart, because smart people live where the weather is good. And it was just kind of a funny remark. And he was kind of rude, though, and I was talking out loud, thinking out loud in the parts room one day, just talking to myself. And I said, let's see, in '86 they did this, in '88 they did that. And he says, and I wasn't even talking to anybody in particular, but he says, who cares? And there was a clock that had been taken off the wall that didn't work anymore. And he was used to being, because he was from up north, being rude was something he enjoyed. So he looks off up there where the clock used to be, but it's not there. And I said, hey, stupid, what are you looking up there for? There's no clock up there. And he just grinned, because he really thought, hey, it feels like home for everybody to be rude to each other, you know. There was a mechanic that would come in there sometimes, and he would have no information whatsoever practically, and he would want him to look up his parts. And the joke was, he didn't know what he was working on, but he expected him to pull a rabbit out of a hat. One time, this guy, we had these Jeeps that were giving trouble because of the olefins that were piling up on the valves, and Ford had us walnut blast those. Well, Jeep didn't really have a fix for that. And so what they did was they sent us some engine controllers for these, and these were the ones that were 87 to 1990. They had the Bendix fuel injection system on them, you know, where the engine controller was mounted above the gas pedal. And so we had to change a bunch of those controllers, because the way Jeep was doing it, they would initially they would saturate those olefin deposits to try to make sure that there was plenty of gasoline soaked into them, so that it wouldn't stumble so bad. Now later on, I figured out a way to use Ford's walnut oil blaster to clean that carbon off those valves in those Jeeps, fixed a bunch of them like that. But for a long time, we were having to replace the engine controllers on them for that. It was a program. And I had a stack of those engine controllers. I mean, I must have had 10 or 12 of them out there leaning up on that bookshelf there, which is my stall for back then was where the bookshelf was. And so this guy went in the parts room. He needed an engine controller for a Jeep for some other reason. And most of them were about the same anyway. You could just about swap them out. You know, they were plug and play from one to the other. And he says he wanted to buy one that was $600. And he says, gosh, I don't want to pay $600 for this. And the parts people told him, go out there and talk to Richard. He's got a bunch of those. He'll probably sell you one. And so I had a bunch of them out there, and I didn't care if I sold them or not. Didn't need the money. And the guy comes out there, and he says, how much for one of those engine controllers? I said, $125. He says, oh my goodness, would you take 100? I said, $135. He goes, wait a minute, you're going the wrong direction. Would you take 95? I said, $145. He said, well, I'll give you $125 for it. I said, okay, that's what I wanted to start with. But it was interesting to me, the parts department sent him out there to buy a used one for me instead of, you know, you wouldn't expect a parts man to do that, but he did, so I sold the guy one. Robert Lucas worked in the body shop, really nice guy, I really like this guy. And one day, he was told he was helping this guy try to find a water leak in the trunk of a vehicle. And so the guy says, this was before the days of cell phones, you got to remember this. So he opens the trunk, and Robert gets in there with a bright flashlight, and so he's out there, you know, just outside the shop. And so Robert is supposed to watch with the flashlight while this guy hoses the back of the car down, you know, around the trunk, so Robert can see where the water's coming into the trunk. And so Robert's in there looking for this water leak and all that. And so the guy taps on the trunk and says, Robert, I'll be back in a minute. I got a phone call over here. Somebody called and asked for the guy. So the guy talks on the phone for about 10 minutes, leaves Robert in the trunk. And then about the time he hangs up, he forgets that Robert's in the trunk, and somebody comes by and says, hey, you want to go to lunch? So he says, yeah. So he went to lunch. So basically, Robert was locked in the trunk of the car for an hour and a half and didn't get let out until the guy came back from lunch and realized that he had left him in there. He was beating on the trunk. Boom, boom, let me out, let me out. Just one of those perfect storms. The dispatcher up there that you see behind the glass, this is an actual picture, he was a real crisp kind of hard to get along to a guy. His name was Dennis. And me and the service writer, David, that I'll show you in a minute, we laughed about what a lousy waiter he would make, because he was sort of irritable and stuff. And when you walked up there to turn in your ticket or to get a new one, if he was in the middle of something, he'd say, "I'll be with in a minute," you know, and he would just, "You're just going to wait." Those was some of the stuff he would say. He also liked to send you back out to the service lot to, you know, for some reason to get a piece of information off of a vehicle that you forgot to write on the ticket or something like that. But the first time I met him was when I went to the Lincoln Mercury dealer in 1984 and worked there for about 4 months. He was a service manager there, but he had worked at this dealership. He went to the service manager's job over there at the Lincoln dealership for a while, and then he came back to be the dispatcher again at this dealership here, and that was the dispatch office. That's a shop foreman's office right there. And to go up these stairs, there was a training room up there, you know, where we would do our training, and we had a lot of books and stuff up there in the library and all that kind of thing. But anyway, this guy right here is the service manager of the Nissan dealership now. And he was a trainee at the time. He was just like 18 years old. That guy's name was Andy. I don't remember this guy, who he is, but anyway, I don't recognize him in that picture. But Dennis, the dispatcher, would not have made a good waiter. Now, my son Matt spent a summer or two with me over there working. And what was funny about this thing right here, this is Matt working at my toolbox, you know, which is always cluttered. The front end man, I would type, see that typewriter, at Royal Typewriter, that my brother bought that for $35 at a garage sale or an antique shop or something, and I used it, I would type my work orders. On the back of the work order, I'd type what I did. Bap, 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 bap. And on that 100D111 front end machine, they had a keyboard, and you could basically type what you did on that, and it would print out like that. And the service manager got so impressed with my typed up work orders that he's told the front end man who worked right next in the next service bay to me on his front end lift, he says, "You need to start typing all of your work orders." And I said, and he says, "Now that you've been typing all your work orders, he's wanting to make me type all of mine. This is ridiculous." And so the service writer, Robert, came out there, and he was wearing this tie that had 3 hogs on it, you know, 3 pigs. And he didn't have it tied like, you know, like the way I like to see a tie tied. But he didn't really, believe it or not, he wore a tie every day, but didn't know how to tie one. And Robert, I said, "Look, if that knot right there doesn't look as good as it could if you'd let me tie it, show you how to tie it." He says, "Okay." And so he took the tie off, and I untied it, and I put it around my neck, and I was working on getting it tied right. And the front end guy saw me putting that tie around my neck. He says, "Get that tie off your neck," because he was afraid I was going to be wearing a tie, and the service manager would make everybody start wearing a tie. Anyway, that was a little silly little thing. It was me cooking breakfast for my wife. And see, I had to really, I was a short order cook. I don't do anything except short order cooks. I cook breakfast, but the bacon and all this other stuff like she does, I don't have any way of doing it. I don't know how to make any of the stuff she knows how to make, but I can do a short order. I can do bacon and eggs and all that. One time I threatened to make biscuits, and she told me no. But anyway, there I was making breakfast in our kitchen. This was David, the service writer, and me in 1989. We were lunch buddies. He went to law school and became an attorney eventually, and so he's a successful attorney right now, and has been for 20 some odd years. So, but anyway, that was. This is an old picture. This would have been I said 89. This could have been 87 or 88. And when he first came to work there, he was driving an 81 Thunderbird, which was one of the most square boxy ones and all. And it was running terrible, and he didn't even know it. He didn't, you know, if he put it in gear and it would go, that's all he knew about it. And I said, this car runs terrible, and some of the ugliest cars I've ever seen. But anyway, service writer, this is what our tickets look like whenever they print them out on a computer by that time. And this is where you get your flag time and all that. And this one right here was, you know, had put an oxygen sensor on that one, 2 hours labor and all that, you know, for troubleshooting and replace the sensor and all that. Well, this one guy, this bald-headed service writer, he came to the parts room one day, and I was working on a brand new Crown Victoria that hadn't even been sold yet. And he says, "Can I take 3 15-amp fuses out of this new car you're working on and give them to a customer?" Because he wanted to be everybody's hero. And I said, "Well, I was just kind of surprised that he would even ask that." And I said, "Well, I suppose, I went there and I watched him take 3 15-amp fuses out of the underhood fuse panel." And so I told the parts guy, Mark, you saw earlier, I said, "Charge this guy out, charge Curtis out with 3 15-amp fuses." And so they handed him an invoice for it, and Curtis came at me with his teeth gritted later and says, "I'm paying for my 15-amp fuses." I said, "Yeah, you are." I said, "I'm not charging them before it after you stole them out of the car and gave them to a customer." Well, I had these radio tools that I made, these horseshoe-shaped radio tools where you stick in there and unlit your radio and pull it out of the dash. and these service riders were borrowing them all the doggone time. And so I used welding rods, and I had an 1/16" socket. I'd bend them around, and I'd grind the little ends and make it just like a regular set of radio tools, homemade. And I made each one of those service riders a set of those radio tools, and immediately they all lost them and kept borrowing mine. One of them wrote a ticket up and said, windshield won't separate rain from water. And I went to this one guy, Dick, he was out there. He says he was always had the idea that he never made a mistake. And so what they were supposed to do was run an online automotive service information system printout on every car. And if it had a recall, they had to write a recall ticket on it because we were responsible for doing those recalls. And so I said, I went out there and I said, you missed a recall on this Explorer. And he goes, no, I got paperwork out here. No, because they were supposed to give us $1 if we caught a recall that they missed. Of course, they never did. And so he looked and looked and dug and hunted and looked, and I said, you might as well quit looking. You're not going to find anything. And I said, he says, what do you mean? I got all the paperwork out here. I said, ain't got no battery box on it. That was the recall. We put a battery box on it. And one day on a situation like that, he loved it when a ticket came back in with a customer complaining that we didn't quite fix it right. Now there was this QC stamp, quality control, and the shop foreman had to sign off on it after you fixed whatever you didn't fix right the first time. And the service riders, particularly Dick, he loved stamping those things because it kind of made the mechanic mad. No mechanic like getting one of those with a QC stamp on it. And one day, you have this anger spike when you go out there and he hands you one of those tickets because that means you're probably not going to get paid anything. So I took his sticky note and I put it on one of his work orders where he made a mistake on writing the work order, and I stamped it with that QC stamp. And I go, I got you a service rider QC here. And he jerked that ticket off. That sticky note off and threw it up in the trash. It made him just as mad as it did anybody else. That was just funny as all get out. Well, this fuel pressure regulator replacement on these 5.8s, had all that plumbing and everything. These guys were grousing that it was so hard to do because the Allen screws were underneath the bottom, and it had 3 Allen screws, and they went in from the bottom, and it was hard to get on them, and had to reach under all that plumbing. You didn't want to take all of it off there. I said, I'll take those out with my 1/4-inch air ratchet. What? How do you do that? And I said, I'll show you. So I put they had one sitting there. I put my T27 Torx bit, which it holds it'll bite an Allen better than an Allen will. And I put that on there, and I spun those 3 bolts out there and had that thing in my hand in about 15 seconds. They've been fighting those. They got this thread locker compound on them too. So they've been fighting those things out of there with an Allen wrench. I couldn't believe they were doing that. Usually I just try to see if I can get something to work, and if it works, fine. If it doesn't, I'm no worse off, And I used to take these books right here. I'd keep the books updated because of the way I got paid. I didn't mind doing that. They paid me, salary plus commission and all that, guaranteed up to a certain number of hours, and then more than that, I always beat my book time anyway. But the foreman and another mechanic got owned by an electrical problem because I had put an orange sticker in the wiring book saying you were supposed to go get this TSB book to look at the revised wiring schematic. They ignored my orange sticker and were trying to use the wiring schematic that didn't work right, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong until I says, look, you see that orange sticker? It tells you which TSB supersedes this. And I went and got it and opened it up, and it was real easy to find that way. They got owned, because they weren't paying attention to the orange stickers I put in the books. All right, this connector was all that was needed on this harness, and this boy that you see turning it upside down working in there on that other vehicle, the big heavy set boy. I had him earlier in a picture in the dispatcher's office. But he was basically, I says, look, you can't get the connector, and this is a customer pay job. And so we had to order the whole wire harness for $225. And he was tempted. He said, why don't we just put the connector on the end of it? I said, this guy's paying for a $225 wire harness and all the labor to put it on there. We need to have integrity and do what we're charging this guy for. And so we put the wire harness on there all the way through. Of course, I always save those wire harnesses, and I save connectors in buckets and stuff. But this one was new enough I didn't have a connector like that. But I tried to explain to him. Years later, I went back when he was working on one, and that may have been this one here. I says, what are you doing under there? And he said, well, I had another situation with a connector, and I thought about integrity, and I figured I could better get in there and replace the whole harness instead of just cutting the connector off and, soldering the heat shrink it on there and all. If they're paying for the wire harness, they need to get the wire harness. You don't need to put a new wire harness under the bench and charge them 6 hours or whatever for changing the wire harness you didn't change. This Diet Pepsi was sitting there just about like you see it right there, and it was brown, had a little foam on the top. And Donnie was, he liked to shake these Diet Pepsis up and let the sweet out of them, and then he would drink them flat. And they usually would sit there and have a little foam. Well, he also chewed tobacco, and he would spit in a Pepsi bottle, and a lot of the times you didn't know what that was. So if it was Pepsi or tobacco spit. So the truck mechanic walks up and said, "What's that?" And I said, "I think that's Donnie's tobacco spit, but I'm not sure." Donnie didn't even know what was going on. He walks up, walks in between us, walks up there, grabs that bottle and turns it up and takes a drink out of it. And I thought the truck mechanic was going to throw up. He turned kind of green and walked off. I couldn't have set that up if I'd have tried. And so anyways, when he picked it up and took a drink out of it, whatever. And this guy right here was funny. See that big guy on the left over there? The funny thing about it was, Terry was working on this door panel of his truck, and he was taking a pretty good while. And he says, and so this guy was smack talking, the guy that you just saw over walking off. He was kind of a husky guy, you know, thought he was big and bad. So he told the service rider, he says, if I would get out there and, you know, kick this guy's butt, maybe he could, you know, work a little faster and get my truck fixed. And so Levi, the service rider, opened the door and pointed him. I said, "There he is, right over there, working on it." And he says, "Why don't you go over there and tell him that yourself?" And the guy walked over there, and I was watching because I heard all of this going on, and I watched that guy. And that guy walked over, and he watched Terry work for just a minute. And Terry looked up and said, "Can I help you with something?" And the guy says, "Hey, how you doing?" And he went back out to the write-up area. He decided he wasn't going to, you know, get all smack talking bad with this dude here. And Terry was about that big. You know, that was one of the things that this guy here thought he was big, but Terry was bigger, and he was messed up. I mean, he was intimidated. Well, Larry Sellers, I had an air horn that I had a piece of, I had a fitting so I could plug an air hose into it, and then I could use the little air valve, and wham, and it came off a big truck. And the truck mechanic gave me the old air horn, and I would do that to signal everybody it was time for lunch. Well, Philip Kirkland, I hadn't mentioned him before, he's not the shop foreman, a different guy. He's letting his lift down over there, and it was late at 9. It was this beacon flashing on this big truck that was coming by outside because it's a big old wrecker. And he was wondering, that wrecker kept getting louder and louder and louder, and we didn't even think about any of that. Well, Larry Sellers had this air horn that was sneaking up behind him, and he was standing about 4 feet behind him. And Philip started trying to turn his head to look and see why this wrecker was sounding like it was so close. And I said, "Look out!" And Larry Sellers went, wah, blew that horn. And I thought Philip Kirkland was going to faint. He just about, you know, his eyes glazed over, his knees buckled. But, you know, I was already thinking there was a truck about to run over him, and all that did was cement that. Well, this is the end of it. We've been here 35 minutes. I don't think anybody has lasted to this point, but I appreciate you guys coming by, and I'll talk to y'all next time.